Welcome back to our channel where we explore the rich world of philosophy through the lens of classic literature. Today, we're diving into Fyodor Dostoevsky's monumental novel, Crime and Punishment, and examining the complex character of Rodion Raskolnikov. Let's start by setting the scene. Raskolnikov is a young, impoverished former law student living in St. Petersburg. As we meet him, he's plagued by a sense of inner turmoil and a persistent feeling of isolation. He's caught between a desire to achieve greatness and a harsh reality that has left him disillusioned and desperate. He's intelligent, but in a deeply conflicted way, and his pride often drives him to act out of pure self-will. At his core, Raskolnikov is a man wrestling with his own philosophy, a unique and dangerous belief that some people are entitled to transcend moral laws if it serves a greater purpose. Early in the novel, Raskolnikov asks himself, "Am I a trembling creature, or do I have the right?" This question marks the beginning of his ideological journey, one that will push him to commit one of the most infamous acts in literary history, the murder of the pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna. This act is not just a desperate crime, it's a philosophical experiment. Raskolnikov is deeply influenced by the idea of the extraordinary man, a theory he develops partly from the influence of contemporary thinkers like Napoleon, whom he sees as historical figures who broke laws to achieve greatness. Raskolnikov wonders if he, too, can act outside conventional morality to shape his destiny. It's important to understand that he's not a typical criminal. He doesn't kill out of pure malice or even out of survival. Instead, he kills as an experiment to see if he can assert his will in the face of moral convention. Now, let's break down Raskolnikov's complex motivations. First, there's his crushing poverty. In the novel's opening scenes, we see him living in a cramped, nearly uninhabitable room, barely scraping by. This poverty fuels his resentment towards society, which he sees as fundamentally unjust. Yet, it's not just his circumstances that motivate him. It's a deep-seated belief that he's capable of great things, that he's different, even superior. He believes that people fall into two categories, the ordinary and the extraordinary, with the latter holding a higher moral status and the right to bend or break the laws of society if it leads to something greater. This view is a distortion of the philosophy of utilitarianism, which argues that the morality of an action is determined by its outcomes, or in other words, the greatest good for the greatest number. However, Raskolnikov takes it further. He believes that he has the right to decide not only what's best for him, but also what's best for society, even if it involves morally repugnant. One key scene that encapsulates Raskolnikov's inner struggle happens shortly after the murder, when he reflects on his motivations and the act itself. He says, "It wasn't a human being I killed, it was a principle." This line is crucial because it reveals that, in his mind, the murder was a philosophical exercise rather than a crime against another human being. In distancing himself from the brutality of his actions, Raskolnikov convinces himself that he was testing a theory rather than taking a life. But his guilt and paranoia soon begin to unravel this illusion, suggesting that our moral intuitions are more deeply ingrained than we might think. So, what does this tell us about Raskolnikov as a character? Raskolnikov is a man of contradictions. He's both prideful and vulnerable, compassionate yet capable of cold logic. He deeply loves his family and goes to great lengths to support them, yet he's also willing to commit a brutal crime to test his philosophical beliefs. He wants to help humanity, but is repulsed by the realities of human suffering. This paradoxical nature is at the heart of Dostoevsky's exploration of human psychology and the limits of ideology. The philosophical groundwork of Crime and Punishment is deeply tied to Raskolnikov's inner struggle. Dostoevsky uses him to explore the dangers of intellectual pride, the cost of radical individualism, and the limits of moral relativism. Raskolnikov's journey is one of self-destruction, but it's also a quest for meaning in a world where he feels profoundly alienated. One of the most memorable passages early in the novel is when Raskolnikov dreams of a horse being beaten to death in the streets. In the dream, he's a child, helplessly watching as the horse suffers and dies under the whip of its owner. This moment represents Raskolnikov's buried empathy, his horror at cruelty and injustice. The dream foreshadows the guilt and psychological torment that will plague him later, hinting that deep down, he understands the moral horror of violence, even if he intellectually tries to dismiss it. So, how does this background set the stage for his philosophical journey? By creating Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky gives us a character who embodies the dangers of unchecked ideology and unexamined beliefs. Raskolnikov believes he's rational, that he can determine his own moral code, but as we'll see in the coming sections, his actions trigger a cascade of psychological consequences that suggest our sense of morality is much more complex than any philosophy can define. In this way, Crime and Punishment forces us to confront some difficult questions. Can we really justify harming others for the sake of a higher purpose? Are some people truly above the moral laws that govern society? And what happens when our actions betray our deepest values? Through Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky invites us to explore these questions not just intellectually, but emotionally, through the life of a character who embodies the extremes of human experience. To understand Raskolnikov's actions and beliefs, we need to look at the setting that shapes him. Crime and Punishment is set in 1860s St. Petersburg, a city marked by rapid modernization, extreme poverty, and intense social stratification. This setting isn't just a backdrop, it plays a crucial role in Raskolnikov's psychological and philosophical development, highlighting existential tension, societal fractures, and the cultural conflicts of the time. St. Petersburg, with its overcrowded tenements, dark alleys, and the oppressive weight of poverty, is a kind of character in itself, mirroring Raskolnikov's internal chaos. The city's atmosphere is bleak and claustrophobic, pressing in on him and exacerbating his feelings of despair, disillusionment, and alienation. Life here is hard, and people are often pushed to the edge. Raskolnikov's constant exposure to suffering, the poverty of his own family, the desperation of his fellow students, the plight of the downtrodden, like the abused drunkard Marmeladov and his family, reinforces his view of the world as unjust and unyielding. Let's look at one powerful scene that encapsulates this setting and its impact on Raskolnikov's psyche. Early in the novel, he overhears a conversation in a tavern between a student and an officer. They discuss the old pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna, describing her as a worthless, vile old woman who hoards wealth while the poor around her suffer. The student suggests that killing her and redistributing her wealth could benefit many, framing it almost as a logical solution to an economic and ethical problem. This conversation deeply affects Raskolnikov, feeding into his own desperate ideation. He's constantly surrounded by suffering that seems pointless and is inescapable. When he hears others endorsing the idea that Alyona's death could be morally justified for the greater good, it's as though society itself is echoing his thoughts. The sheer poverty, inequality, and utilitarian reasoning in this conversation reinforce his growing belief that he, too, has a right to step outside conventional morality if it leads to something higher or better. Here we see how society's stark realities are molding his perspective, making it easier for him to justify extreme actions. This scene highlights a central philosophical struggle in Crime and Punishment, the existential crisis faced by an individual within a dehumanizing society. Raskolnikov's belief in the extraordinary man who transcends common morality is partly a response to the harsh realities he sees around him. In a way, he sees himself as challenging a meaningless, indifferent world by imposing his own form of meaning and order upon it. Influenced by utilitarian and nihilistic ideas, he convinces himself that the end can justify the means. If society is indifferent to suffering, then why shouldn't an individual step beyond traditional morals for a higher purpose? Yet Dostoevsky uses Raskolnikov to warn against this very line of thinking. In his philosophical isolation, Raskolnikov loses his connection to the humanity he claims to want to serve. By buying into a distorted utilitarian philosophy and convincing himself he has the right to improve the world through force, he turns himself into a monster, haunted, alienated, and burdened with guilt. This is where the existential element emerges. Raskolnikov's crisis is not just moral but also deeply existential. He's grappling with the absurdity and randomness of life, feeling increasingly detached from any sense of objective or divine morality. His response is to try to assert himself as an individual by exerting his will, almost as a way to create his own meaning in a meaningless world. However, this choice ultimately alienates him from society, his family, and even himself. The novel suggests that without empathy, without an understanding of shared human suffering, individualism devolves into egoism, leading to destruction. Through Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky explores how a cold, impersonal society can distort a person's values and within the most intelligent mind. The world around Raskolnikov, a world of poverty and suffering, has convinced him that normal morality is a luxury that only the privileged can afford. In a society that fails its most vulnerable members, He comes to believe that he must create his own rules. But in doing so, he pays a devastating price. In sum, Dostoevsky's St. Petersburg is a place where survival seems to demand moral compromise, and Raskolnikov's belief in his own superiority and right to act outside moral law is both a product of this environment and a critique of it. Raskolnikov embodies a response to a society that is, in many ways, existentially barren, but his journey reveals that embracing one's humanity, despite the suffering, is the only path to genuine redemption. Raskolnikov's central internal conflict is a war between his intellectual arrogance and his innate moral conscience, a tension between his desire to transcend conventional morality and the undeniable pull of guilt, empathy, and human connection. This conflict centers around his belief that he could live above ordinary moral constraints, a conviction that crumbles as he faces the reality of his actions. His inner turmoil revolves around his struggle to reconcile his theory of the extraordinary man with the visceral, haunting guilt he experiences after murdering the pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna. A pivotal moment that crystallizes this inner struggle occurs shortly after the murder. Raskolnikov is racked with feverish paranoia, and while hiding the stolen goods, he suddenly collapses, whispering, "It wasn't a human being I killed, it was a principle." This statement reveals his attempts to justify his actions, to detach himself from the horrific reality of the murder by framing it as a mere test of his philosophical theory. Yet, despite his attempts to intellectualize the crime, he can't escape the overwhelming sense of horror that has begun to consume him. The significance of this moment lies in the breakdown of Raskolnikov's belief in his own superiority. He had convinced himself that, like historical figures he admires, he could break society's moral codes if it served a higher purpose. His extraordinary man theory is influenced by utilitarianism, but twisted by a Nietzschean idea that certain individuals can transcend societal laws. Raskolnikov reasons that he, too, should be able to operate above traditional morals, believing he can rid the world of an insignificant and malignant person for the sake of others' well-being. But after committing the crime, his feverish guilt reveals that he is not, in fact, beyond human morality. He is still bound to it, and his attempt to reject it leaves him psychologically and emotionally shattered. Raskolnikov's struggle is Dostoevsky's critique of radical individualism and moral relativism, two ideas that gained traction in 19th century intellectual circles. Through Raskolnikov, Dostoevsky explores the dangers of believing that individuals can place themselves above universal moral principles. While Raskolnikov tries to convince himself that his crime was justified, his conscience asserts itself forcefully, suggesting that morality may be an inescapable, inherent aspect of human nature rather than a social construct that can be cast aside. In philosophical terms, this conflict touches on existentialism's theme of authenticity. Raskolnikov tries to invent a version of himself who is strong, rational, and capable of playing God with other people's lives. Yet his true self, his inherent empathy and moral compass, fights against this artificial self-image, exposing his Superman persona as a hollow facade. Dostoevsky seems to argue that no one can truly live without regard for the moral laws that bind society, that attempts to do so result in self-deception and profound psychological suffering. Another layer of this philosophical turmoil lies in Raskolnikov's isolation. His attempt to set himself apart from ordinary humanity leads him to alienation, loneliness, and self-imposed exile. Dostoevsky uses this to critique the existential notion of radical autonomy, the idea that individuals can create their own meaning and morality independently. Raskolnikov tries to be entirely self-sufficient, intellectually detached, and morally autonomous, but this endeavor leads him only to despair. He becomes trapped in his own mind, cut off from the connections and relationships that give life purpose. Ultimately, Dostoevsky suggests that authentic meaning comes not from detachment but from connection, from shared humanity. This theme reaches a climax in Raskolnikov's interactions with Sonya, a young woman who suffers but remains morally grounded and compassionate. Sonya's self-sacrificing nature contrasts sharply with Raskolnikov's intellectual coldness, and it's through her that he begins to confront the depth of his inner conflict. She embodies a philosophy of compassion and redemption, grounded in shared suffering rather than superiority or individual willpower. Her presence forces Raskolnikov to acknowledge his guilt, his need for forgiveness, and his inescapable humanity. In essence, Raskolnikov's internal conflict is Dostoevsky's way of exploring profound existential questions. Can we escape our moral conscience? What happens when we try to impose our own rules on the world, divorced from empathy and human connection? Is there an essential, universal morality, or are all values subjective? Through Raskolnikov's psychological collapse, Dostoevsky seems to argue that human beings cannot and should not divorce themselves from the moral principles that bind them to others. This inner turmoil, born of his attempt to live as an extraordinary man, becomes his undoing and ultimately leads him to seek redemption. His journey suggests that we cannot create a meaningful life solely through intellect or individual power. Instead, we must acknowledge our shared humanity and embrace the moral responsibility that comes with it. Raskolnikov's philosophical beliefs are built around the distorted concept of the extraordinary, a belief system that echoes elements of nihilism, utilitarianism, and proto-existentialism. His core belief is that certain individuals possess the right to bypass ordinary moral codes if they have a vision that serves a higher purpose. Raskolnikov tries to place himself among this elite class of extraordinary people, those who can transgress societal norms and laws for the supposed benefit of society. He imagines himself as a potential world changer, someone who could escape the bonds of conventional morality to act in ways that ordinary people cannot. One of the most telling moments that showcases this belief occurs in a monologue in which he says, "I wanted to dare and I killed. I wanted to find out then and quickly whether I was a louse like all the rest or a man. Would I be able to step over or not?" Here, Raskolnikov openly questions whether he can transcend human morality and the inherent limitations of most people. This quote captures his core belief, the idea that some people have the power and the right to step beyond the rules of morality to fulfill a grander purpose. It's not about wealth, revenge, or power, it's about self-affirmation and discovering his own place in the world. He sees this stepping over as the ultimate test of his philosophical theory. Raskolnikov's beliefs reflect Nietzschean ideas of the Übermensch or Superman, which, although Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment before Nietzsche's works became popular, foreshadows Nietzsche's concept of an individual who creates their own values outside of societal norms. This Superman figure lives by a self-imposed code rather than the moral restrictions of society. Raskolnikov seeks to test whether he can be one of these extraordinary individuals, capable of breaking moral conventions if it leads to something greater. However, Dostoevsky critiques this notion by illustrating the catastrophic consequences of such beliefs. In attempting to cast himself as a Superman, Raskolnikov's internal world begins to fracture, revealing that true self-transcendence cannot come from superiority or violence. Raskolnikov's philosophy also borrows from utilitarianism, though he perverts it. He initially justifies his crime by claiming that the death of a useless old pawnbroker could benefit others in society. Here, Raskolnikov adopts the utilitarian idea that an action's morality can be determined by its outcomes, specifically the greater good. However, Dostoevsky uses Raskolnikov's mental breakdown to illustrate that human life cannot be reduced to cold calculations. The novel challenges the idea that we can abstractly quantify good and evil, suggesting that morality may be too complex to fit within utilitarian logic. Finally, his belief system is tinged with nihilism. Raskolnikov's rejection of established moral laws and his desire to test his own ability to live without guilt reflect a form of moral nihilism, a worldview that denies any inherent value or meaning in moral constructs. His desire to step over morality aligns with this idea, as he believes that, as an individual, he can create his own values. However, this nihilistic drive ultimately unravels as his guilt and inner turmoil demonstrate that he is not psychologically or morally equipped to live in a moral vacuum. Dostoevsky seems to argue that no individual can genuinely escape a shared human conscience. Raskolnikov's inner conflict also touches on existentialist ideas, particularly the search for meaning and self-definition in an indifferent world. In testing his ability to kill without remorse, Raskolnikov is essentially trying to create his own meaning, to define himself as a powerful, autonomous individual. However, his existential experiment ultimately fails. Dostoevsky uses this failure to suggest that meaning cannot be found through acts of superiority or moral transgression. Instead, it is through human connection, compassion, and self-sacrifice embodied by the character of Sonya that a deeper, more genuine meaning emerges. In sum, Raskolnikov's core beliefs are a complex mixture of philosophical ideas, yet each one ultimately leads him into profound moral and psychological crisis. Dostoevsky critiques these philosophies by demonstrating that attempts to live outside of shared human values, lead not to freedom but to isolation, despair, and self-destruction. Raskolnikov's journey suggests that humanity cannot escape its collective moral conscience, nor can individuals find true meaning in the denial of empathy and connection. Instead, Dostoevsky hints that authentic purpose arises from an acceptance of one's place within a moral community and an embrace of shared human suffering. A major turning point in Raskolnikov's story occurs in his intense encounter with Sonya, the young woman forced into prostitution to support her family. This meeting marks a shift in Raskolnikov's understanding of morality, guilt, and redemption. Up to this point, he has been attempting to rationalize his crime through his extraordinary man theory, clinging to the idea that he can rise above conventional morality. But in Sonya, Raskolnikov encounters a force of pure compassion and self-sacrifice that unsettles his philosophy. A key scene that signals this shift occurs when Sonya reads him the story of Lazarus from the Bible. Raskolnikov, visibly shaken, listens as she describes how Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, a narrative that symbolizes resurrection, redemption, and spiritual rebirth. After hearing it, he becomes emotional, revealing his vulnerability and his need for forgiveness. The image of Lazarus rising from the dead stirs something within him, hinting at his potential for transformation. One of the most significant quotes that marks this turning point is when Raskolnikov confesses to Sonya, "It was I killed the old pawnbroker woman and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them." This confession, unthinkable for him earlier, reflects his growing awareness of the human weight of his crime, a weight that can no longer be explained away through intellectual theories. His admission to Sonya signals a shift from viewing his crime as a philosophical experiment to recognizing it as a moral and spiritual burden he must confront. This moment is significant because it represents Raskolnikov's realization that intellectual detachment cannot erase the inherent guilt and moral consequences of his actions. Dostoevsky uses this turning point to critique the dangers of radical intellectualism and moral relativism. Up to this point, Raskolnikov has tried to live by his own constructed morality, detached from compassion and empathy. In confessing to Sonya, however, he begins to recognize that he cannot simply will away his guilt, his conscience is inescapable, and he cannot live as if human lives are expendable principles. Philosophically, this turning point also emphasizes the limitations of existential autonomy. Raskolnikov's attempt to create his own moral code has left him alienated and despairing. In confessing to Sonya, he begins to see that true meaning may come from connection rather than detachment, from accepting shared humanity rather than aspiring to cold intellectual superiority. Sonya, despite her suffering, embodies a humble and unconditional empathy, which gradually prompts Raskolnikov to acknowledge that no philosophy or ideology can replace genuine human connection. Additionally, Dostoevsky uses this turning point to challenge the notion of moral nihilism. Raskolnikov's journey shows that even when someone intellectually denies morality, guilt remains as a psychological and spiritual reality. Through Sonya's example, Dostoevsky proposes that moral and spiritual redemption comes not from isolating oneself or attempting to transcend human norms, but from recognizing one's own flaws, connecting with others, and embracing humility. In sum, this confession scene is the first step toward Raskolnikov's redemption. It's a moment where his philosophical experiment crumbles under the weight of empathy and the need for forgiveness, revealing that human nature may be fundamentally bound to a moral conscience that we cannot simply escape or ignore. The conclusion of Raskolnikov's journey is one of painful yet profound transformation. After his arrest and subsequent sentencing to Siberian prison, Raskolnikov's inner conflict and philosophical delusions gradually dissolve, leaving him stripped down to the raw realities of guilt, shame, and, ultimately, the possibility of redemption. This final stage is marked by his recognition that intellectual theories cannot stand up to the realities of human suffering and moral responsibility. The journey that began with arrogance and isolation ends in an emotional and existential awakening. A significant quote that captures his final state comes from the epilogue when Raskolnikov experiences a moment of clarity about the limitations of his beliefs. But here begins a new accounting, a new story, the story of a man's gradual renewal, his gradual rebirth, his gradual transfiguration from one world to another, his acquaintance with a new, hitherto completely unknown reality. This might make the subject of a new story, but our present story is ended. In this passage, Dostoevsky describes Raskolnikov's transformation not as an immediate revelation, but as the beginning of a long, painful process of renewal and rebirth. The emphasis on a new story suggests that Raskolnikov's journey is far from over, but he has finally acknowledged that his previous beliefs were fundamentally flawed. His proud, nihilistic ideas have broken down, and he is now embarking on a path grounded in humility, acceptance, and a willingness to connect with others. This shift symbolizes his existential awakening, an acceptance of human vulnerability and interconnectedness that he previously tried to reject. The conclusion of Raskolnikov's journey speaks to the themes of existentialism, particularly the quest for meaning and the struggle to accept one's place within a larger human framework. Throughout the novel, Raskolnikov tries to live as an autonomous being, accountable only to himself and his theories, but this leads him to a psychological dead end. His eventual breakdown and emotional rebirth suggest that genuine purpose and meaning come from connection, empathy, and the acceptance of shared moral and existential truths. Dostoevsky's portrayal of Raskolnikov's redemption suggests that the human condition is defined not by intellect alone, but by compassion and a deep-seated need for others. Through suffering and humility, Raskolnikov begins to see the value in human relationships, in accepting one's limitations, and in embracing a life that transcends cold rationality. Dostoevsky implies that real freedom is not about breaking moral rules or transcending humanity, but about facing oneself honestly and finding purpose through acceptance, not superiority. Ultimately, Raskolnikov's journey illuminates the existential theme that human beings cannot manufacture meaning in isolation or through radical intellectual detachment. Instead, meaning emerges from an acceptance of our interconnectedness, shared suffering, and a willingness to embrace love and humility, even in the face of personal failures. His journey toward redemption shows that understanding the human condition involves confronting our fallibility, finding strength in vulnerability, and realizing that true transformation requires both inner and outer connections to the world. If you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more philosophical explorations. See you next time.